Hello, I am Jose Del Villar, and today we'll be discussing on the racism within the Zoot riots. Now, for my introduction, I have my argument and thesis. And basically, the riots were a racially motivated incident that occurred for a whole week from June 3rd, 1943 till June 8th, 1943 in Los Angeles, California. The targets in question in this specific incident were mainly Mexican Americans and African Americans. Chicano and Chicanas were known at the time to become fashionably rebellious and began to dress in their zoot suit style. Due to this different style going against the everyday norms, white U.S. Navy sailors gathered up and racially attacked any Mexican American and African American for wearing a zoot suit. This is what I mainly want to focus on. It is all based on the racism that played a huge factor in igniting the riots. Overall, I believe that the idea of racism was the main cause for these riots because the Navy sailors strictly targeted Mexican Americans and African Americans. And best be sure, if they were Caucasian, they would not be bothered. Now on the right, I have a historical image from the Batman archive, and it showcases the actual white Navy sailormen from the riots, and how you can see that they are holding different weapons such as pipes and clubs, and they actually use these weapons to attack all the Zoot Suiters. Now, to further expand my argument and thesis, most, if not all, white Americans in the United States grew a hatred towards Zoot Suiters because the suits apparently were seen as a waste of cloth during a time where war rations were limited and scarce, especially during a time when America was in the midst of World War II. Now, due to this hatred of Zoot Suiters wasting crucial resources, it then caused a whole opposition from people who mobbed and stripped those who wore any Zoot Suits. It would later become even more saddening once you realize that the majority of Zoot Suiters in California were of Mexican descent, therefore being racially targeted in the first place. Now, the Zoot Suits began as a prominent style because it represented the overall Mexican youth, rebellious adolescents, and the criminal world. And on the right, I have another historical picture that showcases 4 Mexican American Zoot Suiters and how they perfectly exemplify the style of the Zoot suit with the way they're dressed. Now, I quickly just wanted to showcase how Zoot Suiters actually looked like and dressed at the time. And on the left, we have a Mexican American male by the name of Manuel Ibarra. And here he perfectly showcases a Zoot suit style by the way his suit is just hung open, the way it's just like slicked down, and the way he's wearing his high waist pants up to his waist. And then on the right, we have a Mexican American female by the name of Mary Martel, and she exemplifies the Zoot suit style by the way she wears her slick dress, her very nice shoes, and her hairdo, which a lot of female Zoot suiters wore at the time. Now, for my sources, I use 3 to back up my thesis. This first source is an article titled The Los Angeles Zoot Suit Riots Revisited, Mexican and Latin American Perspectives by author Richard Griswold del Castillo, and in it he mainly talks about the specific viewpoints of Hispanics and Latin Americans towards the Zoot Suit riots. Del Castillo's main argument in his article is to focus solely on Hispanic outsider perspectives towards this incident, although Del Castillo also talks heavily about the issues of racism that played an effect here, which ties into my personal thesis on this subject. Del Castillo quotes by saying, "This episode in American history has been interpreted by Chicano historians as one in a long series of anti-Mexican reactions motivated by wartime frustrations and racial stereotyping against Mexican American youth." And what caught my attention about this article is how Del Castillo, as I mentioned, focused mainly on Hispanic perspectives and their reactions towards the riot. And for a lot of Hispanics and Mexican Americans, they were saddened and they were hurt by how these white sailormen and white folk were just being racist towards Mexican Americans and African Americans. And they just found it very hurtful how these white folk just were purely anti-Mexican. Now, the next source in question is another article titled Los Angeles Geopolitics and the Zoot Suit Riot in 1943 by author Eduardo Obregon Pagan. And in his article, he not only goes over the racial influence that began the riots, but he mainly glosses over the study of geography in Los Angeles and how Mexican Americans were easily targeted. In his source, he provides audiences with a deep study of how the poorer neighborhoods in Los Angeles housed most of the Mexican American Zoot Suiters, and because of that, they were easily targeted by the sailormen. In his article, Pagan says, I argue that city planners first complicated the social geography of these low-income, mostly Mexican-American neighborhoods in erecting a $1 million training school for the all-white Navy there. Not only did this make all the more obvious the wages of racialized privilege, it also exposed the families in this area to the widespread problem of controlling the often uncivil behavior of military men on leave. In his quote, he touches on the topic of racism, which correlates to my main argument about how the riots were heavily racially motivated in the first place. And on the right, I actually included a image of a map that is from Eduardo's article. And in this map, it showcases the geolocations of the poor neighborhoods that housed these Mexican-American Zoot suiters and African-American Zoot suiters. And what basically interested me overall is how Pagan mainly wanted to analyze the geopolitics and the geolocations of these neighborhoods and how these white Navy sailormen racially assumed that this is where these Zoot suiters lived. So that is why these sailormen traveled to these neighborhoods just to find these African-American and Mexican-American Zoot suiters to attack them. And this is basically where the riots began. Now, the last source I want to cite is an article titled Los Angeles Zoot Suit Riot, Race Riot, the Pachuco, and Black Music Culture by author Douglas Henry Daniels. And in this article, he informs the reader about how the Zoot Suit culture actually began with African Americans, and it was later picked up by Mexican Americans and Filipinos. In his article, he not only focuses on the horrible racial right of the Zoot Suit, but he deeply analyzes the participation of African Americans as well. I can see where his thesis stands because, for the most part, when people think about the Zoot Suit riots, they automatically assume it was purely Mexican Americans that were attacked. Yet, African Americans who originated the culture were racially attacked as well. In the article, Daniel says there was an obvious racist dimension. Brown and African Americans in Zoot suits were targeted, while whites wearing the garb were sparred. His quote not only includes his personal argument of how much African Americans were also unfortunately attacked in the riots, but it also connects heavily to my main thesis about the idea of racism being the major factor in this riot igniting. And what interests me overall with this article is how Daniels kind of shied away from talking about the Mexican American perspectives and instead went into detail about how African Americans originated the Zoot suit culture and the Zoot suit style. And basically how the two races of African Americans and Mexican Americans had to deal together with these racial riots. Now, in conclusion, the Zoot Suit riots in the summer of 1943 was an unfortunate event that occurred, and it is a dark part of American history because it ties heavily into the subject of racism. Not only were Mexican Americans attacked, but African Americans who first began wearing the Zoot suits were also racially targeted and stripped of their clothes. My main argument that racism as the main factor in the riots beginning is proven factually by the three sources I included and how, despite their arguments shifting differently, they still mention the crucial detail about how racism was heavily involved in this historical incident. And on the right, I just wanted to lastly include another historical image from the Batman archive. And it showcases a group of Mexican-American male Zoot suiters and how they occupied the jail cells at the time. Now, this picture was actually taken on the week of the Zoot Suit riots, and how the Zoot suiters were wrongfully arrested just for wearing their Zoot suits. And this is my bibliography of the sources that I used, and that about does it. And I want to thank you for watching and listening.